You are listening to The Central Cast, a podcast for mystics and misfits just like you, recorded every week in Pasadena, California, before a live audience. Thanks for tuning in. Thank you. This last Thursday, the 9th, was the 81st anniversary of the execution of Dietrich Bonhoeffer at Flossenburg concentration camp just outside Berlin, Germany. For those of you, I talk about Bonhoeffer every now and then. He's been a big influence. His work, his legacy, his writings have been a big influence on me and others in this congregation. He was executed, of course, by the Nazis for being an outspoken critic of the regime from the 1930s. He had a radio show in the 1930s when it was still legal for him to have a radio show where he openly criticized the regime across the airwaves in, Weimar Republic, 1930-something Germany. But he also took part in an assassination plot against the Austrian mustache man, albeit his role was pretty minimal. He just passed along information for more of the stronger actors in that plot. But nevertheless, he was arrested and he was interned in various concentration camps. And then when the Allies were pressing further into Germany in April of 1945, the war ended early May. This was right at the end. The camp had to be abandoned. The guards had to abandon the post. But before they did, they put everybody to death, including Bonhoeffer. He was, for most of his career, he was a fairly traditional, orthodox Christian thinker, theologian. However, his beliefs changed significantly toward the end of his life while he was in prison. And he was confronted with the atrocities of his nation and how the church, the German church, capitulated with the Nazis, capitulated with fascism, and that shook him to his core. And so he deconstructed, we would say. That's not a term he used, but that's a term we use, right? He deconstructed, and his departure from orthodoxy are recorded in his letters and papers from prison. He wrote extensively to his friends and wrote essays in prison, and we have a really good record of that. All of this is available online for free, and it's phenomenal and seminal stuff, as his writings inspired countless people over the last 80 years, including me, and really an entire school of thought that's been really influential on me and this church called radical theology, aka death of God theology, the work of Peter Rollins and many others. Are deeply influenced by Bonhoeffer's thoughts and his letters and papers from prison. While he was in prison, to be more specific about his thought, he came to reject biblical inerrancy. He came to reject apologetics, which is like the apologetics, if you're not familiar with that term, is basically the endeavor to use reason and scripture to prove things about God and the supremacy of the Bible or the supremacy of Christianity or whatever. He abandoned that. He considered these ideas to be categorical mistakes. He no longer believed in hell or that Christianity was about individual salvation and getting to go to heaven when you die. Instead, he came to see the gospel of Jesus Christ as being about a weak and powerless God who suffers with us in the world. He coined his views religionless Christianity, which is a great term, religionless Christianity. And here's a quote from one of his prison writings. "The God who is with us is the God who forsakes us. God lets himself be pushed out of the world and onto a cross. He is weak and powerless in the world, and that is precisely the way, the only way in which he helps us and is with us." End quote. In other words, for Bonhoeffer, God was not a distant, omnipotent, supreme being, a stopgap for human problems, but a powerless, suffering presence in the world. God is present not in power and might, but in weakness and in solidarity with human suffering. You can see how incendiary and unorthodox these views were. And it's not hard to figure out where all this came from. He saw firsthand the German church's capitulation with the Nazis. He saw that. And the church's willingness to serve fascism, to serve power, to serve empire. He saw firsthand the enormity of suffering that World War II was causing in Europe and around the world. He saw firsthand the sheer godlessness, the God-forsakenness of it all, and how the church was party to it. And all of this, you could say, obliterated his faith in an all-powerful God, or this kind of traditional Christian Orthodox understanding of God. And yet he did not become an atheist, and he still identified with Christianity. And he came to believe simply that Christianity had to be articulated in a new way in the modern world, and perhaps in a better way. Most modern scholars or most modern evangelicals who revere him today are not aware of any of this. They have not read his letters and papers from prison, or if they have, they don't really understand it, or they don't want to understand it. And if they did understand it, they wouldn't want much to do with him. However, for the rest of us in so-called progressive Christianity today, his deconstruction and his refined understanding of Christianity is like a breath of fresh air. In his words, we find a take on the gospel we can believe in. But we also find in his work a timeless political theology, and that's kind of what we're talking about today and next week with Christina, a timeless political theology that is so relevant for us today. And I want to read a couple of quotes here of his this morning that exemplify his political theology and that exemplify his critique of fascism. And then I will comment on those quotes and then, of course, open it up for a larger discussion as usual. The first quote of his that I want to read is this one. He who separates himself from the confessing church in Germany separates himself from salvation. What does he mean here? The confessing church in Germany at that time was this small anti-fascist offshoot of the state-sanctioned pro-Nazi church in Germany of the 1930s and 40s. This confessing church, this small radical offshoot, rejected the Christian nationalism that plagued Germany at that time. Sound familiar? So they were a reactionary movement in the German church, and they called themselves the confessing church because they confessed what they believed and held to be the authentic anti-fascist gospel of Jesus of Nazareth, who himself was crucified by empire and ran afoul of the religious authorities of his day, the so-called Orthodox authorities of his day, right? This was the confessing church. So Bonhoeffer was really saying, he who separates himself from the anti-fascist church separates himself from Christ himself. That's what he's talking about there. For Bonhoeffer, it was impossible, utterly impossible, to be part of a pro-fascist church and still be part of the body of Christ. These ideas were antithetical to each other. And of course, he wrote this only 3 years into Hitler's rule. And yet he believed this ultimatum needed to be made within Germany. Either you side with the anti-fascist church or you side against Christ. Period. Full stop. There were only two options. Either you side with the anti-fascist church as a devout Christian, if you are one, or you side against Christ. It's really that simple for him. And I believe also for us. And you can imagine he caught hell for this. I mean, this was still in the 1930s. He caught a lot of scorn for it. His career suffered for it. He was labeled too radical, too political, a rabble-rouser. He became persona non grata in a lot of circles, lost some professorships. Such is the case often for those who take a stand against power, yes? There's a price to be paid, the cost of discipleship, we may say, even. And during his time in prison, he wrote an essay aptly titled On Stupidity. This is a great title, On Stupidity. And the essay was, of course, about the utter stupidity, his words, that he saw around him in the German populace that not only gave rise to fascism, but went along with and participated in atrocities, state-sanctioned cruelty, and how the general populace, including the so-called Christians, gave power to obvious buffoons and criminals like Hitler and his lackeys. How was this possible that so many people could behave so stupidly? How is it possible that an entire generation, an entire nation could be conned, just so obviously conned and taken in? Bonhoeffer found himself both fascinated and deeply disturbed by this level of utter stupidity and wondered how and why so many people could go along with it. And so here's an excerpt from his essay on stupidity, which he wrote from his prison cell. Upon closer observation, it becomes apparent that every strong upsurge of power in the public sphere, be it political or religious, infects a large portion of humankind with stupidity. The power of the one needs the stupidity of the other, which is a great line. The fact that the stupid person is also often stubborn must not blind us to the fact that he is not an independent actor. In conversation with him, one virtually feels like one is not dealing at all with just an individual, but with slogans and catchwords and the like that have taken possession of him. Has anybody felt like this before recently? Bonhoeffer goes on. He is under a spell. Great language. He is under a spell, blinded, misused, and abused in his very being. Having thus become a mindless tool, the stupid person will also be capable of any evil, and at the same time incapable of seeing it as evil. This is where the danger lurks. Against stupidity, we are defenseless. Neither protests nor the use of force accomplish anything here. Reason falls on deaf ears, end quote. Written 80-some years ago. Now, his use of the word stupidity here, I'll be honest, feels a little harsh to me and a little over-demeaning. Keep in mind this was written in German, and I'm not sure if the word being translated into English as stupidity is a good translation or not, but I'm going with it because it may be what he actually meant, and sometimes strong language is justified to make a point. But notice, he's not simply blaming the individual for their stupidity, but he's blaming the culture and society itself and the prevailing ideologies of the day that infect and possess individuals and entire communities. I think that's important to realize and to consider. It's very easy to get caught up in cult-like thinking. We should know. I should know. I grew up in the church, in evangelicalism. It's very easy to get caught up in it. It's part of your tribe. It's what everybody else is doing. There's social pressure. A lot of it's unconscious, right? But he's also describing here a kind of lethal combination of stupidity and stubbornness. It's not just that the individuals in question hold ideas and beliefs that are false, nonsensical, and barbaric, but they are completely stubborn and unwilling to listen, to reason, or to consider where they may be wrong. And perhaps one thing feeds into the other, a kind of self-reinforcing cycle of stupidity and stubbornness often exists, does it not? And I think this is what Bonhoeffer was saying. But you really need both to create and spur on a fascist takeover of a nation. In order to go from a liberal democracy and a constitutional republic, which is what Weimar Republic Germany was in the 1920s and 30s, it was a constitutional republic. It was a liberal democracy for all intents and purposes. In order to go from that to a fascist and authoritarian takeover, you need a certain level of stupidity and stubbornness to exist in the general populace. Bonhoeffer understood that. But the question becomes, how does stupidity and stubbornness take over? How does it not only take root in a society and in individuals, how does it take over? Where does it all come from? Bonhoeffer asserts here that it often comes from power itself. It often comes from power itself. He says, the strong upsurge of power in the public sphere, be it of political or religious nature, infects a large part of humankind with stupidity. The power of the one needs the stupidity of the other. And I think he means that really powerful systems and movements, be they political or religious or both, are so overwhelming and frankly scary that people in an act of self-preservation tend to shut down their critical faculties. We want to go along to get along because we're scared. The power is so overwhelming. We're overwhelmed by it. And it causes this kind of stupefaction, if you will, a stupor in the culture. We want to go along to get along because the power is so powerful or so scary. Or maybe people are seduced by power and because we want to be powerful ourselves. We want to align ourselves with the powers that be so that we're on the side of power. That feels good. Even if those powers are profoundly ignorant and cruel, like the Nazis were. The point is, power makes people stupid and stubborn for a few reasons, which is an interesting point. Now, the question obviously becomes, how can we apply these lessons into our context today? And I think it's pretty obvious. I don't think you can make a strong case there for how maybe this crosses over from 80 years ago. But, I want to be careful because the correlations between Germany back then and America today are not one for one or one to one. There are some significant differences, of course, between 1930s, 1940s Germany and 21st century America, right? But nevertheless, the principle remains true, I think. Stupidity is a unique threat to democracy. Stupidity is a unique threat to freedom and human rights, always has been, always will be. A stupid society is also a deeply unethical and immoral society. There is a direct correlation between cruelty and bigotry and a general lack of education and a lack of curiosity about others and about the world and about life. Have you ever considered just the lack of curiosity among some folks about others? A stunning lack of curiosity. I mean, just base level interest in other ways of living life and other cultures and other backgrounds and other points of view. I've heard someone critique evangelicalism before by saying evangelicals are basically people without any questions. They have no interest in the world outside the bubble. That lack of curiosity, I mean, we could call it deliberate stupidity, self-imposed stupidity, a lack of critical thinking skills. You find that there's a direct correlation between acts of cruelty and bigotry and an aversion to science and expertise, this kind of suspicion of experts and people who are educated experts. And, there's this kind of pushback from those folks, a fear of experts in higher education. She's looking for next door, I think. You find prohibitions against questioning authority, right? Prohibitions against doubt and questions and prohibition against questioning traditional ideas and beliefs, right? This kind of stupidity is completely correlated to antisocial and unethical, ideas and behavior. And we see this today in America, right? With book bans, right? With the far right's rejection of established science and higher education, this war against universities, right? This unquestioning commitment to, tradition for tradition's sake. This nostalgia for a time that once was when men were men and women were women and everybody knew their place. We got to get back there again. Times were simpler and everybody just went along with things because things were right, damn it. You know that thinking? This kind of unquestioning commitment to tradition and the worship of authority, this kind of preoccupation with authority and the need to just bow down before authority, don't question, don't rock the boat. Their authority, the pastor, the president. You don't question them. They're the authority. That kind of thinking. It's stupid. And it leads to terrible things. It's just so stupid. The worship of the state, the worship of the flag, right? It's stupid. I'm not saying don't say the Pledge of Allegiance or feel nostalgic about America, or I'm not saying don't feel patriotic sometimes. But this kind of preponderance of you better stand up and sing the anthem or it's crazy. Bonhoeffer's words, while more than 80 years old, are still very pertinent today. And so there's my talk this morning. And I'm curious about what this, I don't know, produces in you. What are your thoughts about some of this? What does this spark for you? Questions about this, about his ideas, if any? Disagreements? Yeah, sir. Just plug this in.
It just made me think about how we will do anything to survive.
Yeah.
And like even with cults, like they don't start as crazy. But then by the time like stuff gets really messed up, you're so far along that if you were to admit what was actually going on, your whole world would collapse.
Yeah.
Like it would be admitting what was actually happening. I feel like would be committing suicide. Like it's like the blocks of all your reality are crumbling down.
Yeah.
To have to admit that. And it makes me think about even like rape victims. Like some certain rape victims will even, like their studies will even afterwards go along with it or like pretend like everything's okay, because admitting the atrocity of what happened is so awful that it's almost easier to just go along with it and just pretend that everything's fine and live in that reality, because it would just cause your entire life to come crumbling down to admit what's happening. And I don't know, I feel like a lot of people are in that right now where they've just gone so far along with it that if they were to admit that, oh man, actually this is fucked up.
Yeah.
Everything would come crashing down.
They would have to.
Yeah.
The fear of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's huge. Absolutely. The anxiety that exists there. Yeah. It's a big part of it. And it's what keeps people imprisoned in those systems. It's Stockholm syndrome, kind of. Yeah. Yeah.
And
right.
I don't know how you save people from that, how you show them that it's worth it to come out of it, to admit it and face it and get on the other side of it.
Yeah.
Because I get it. That's terrifying.
You can't make anyone. You can't. I mean, they've got to be open to a conversation at some level. But that starts with them, not with you or me, right? So.
And I think it's important to not, we look at people like who are in that and be like, I would never do that. I would never do that.
Right.
Maybe you would in a different situation. Maybe you would lie to yourself.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I think we all, in various times in our lives, live in denial of something we don't want to face up to.
Yeah.
And that's just human.
Yeah.
We're all like that. Not just a few of us. Not just, all of us are like that. And that can allow us to have compassion for those folks on the other side.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. That's a really good point. Somebody else say, what is this sparking for you? Yeah, Jose.
Piggybacking off what Sarah said, I just saw something this week that was talking about like how all these movies that we have, all this media about like when fascist systems are brought down, when empires are brought down, it's always after they've already been around for a while.
Okay, yeah.
Nothing ever takes place at the beginning of it, right? Star Wars, the Empire's been around for 30-something years. The Hunger Games, the Capitol and whatever have been reigning for 100 whatever years. It's always the fall of the thing, but it's never like, oh, fascism has started, let's fight it now, right? And so this thing that I was reading was arguing that like we've been predisposed by media to accept that like we can't do anything right now, but we'll be able to do something later on.
Okay.
And so it's really hard for us to fight what's happening because we're like, we don't know how. How do we stop it from rising, right? We only know how to take it down when it's already been established. So that was an interesting thought that this conversation brought to mind. But also, I think it's so true. It's this fear for these people to admit that they were wrong because, and you're seeing a lot of it. Yes, people keep talking about how there's cracks in MAGA right now, but I think a lot of people aren't leaving despite everything because they're afraid to admit that they've been duped. Or that they were wrong, right? A lot of these people who voted for him on single issues because they were like, he's going to be the guy that puts America first and we're going to get out of wars and he's going to bring down prices and whatever. And then he starts going after American citizens and they go, oh, well, I don't like that, but he's still doing this other thing I want. And then he doesn't keep us out of wars and he doesn't bring down prices. And all of a sudden they're like, well, if I admit that I was wrong, I'm going to feel really, really dumb. And it's going to challenge everything that I believe because now this reality that I thought doesn't exist. And that's frightening.
Yeah.
And it's kind of your brain's like way of preserving safety and sanity, because if all of a sudden I admit that everything I knew was wrong, then what does that do to me?
Yeah.
How do I go on like that? And I think both politically and religiously, like that's what stops people from doing that.
Yeah. And it's interesting. There have been studies done on brain chemistry, brain science, to show that, again, these are vast generalities, right? So I'm not speaking about everybody, but there is a particular kind of brain structure and biology behind people that are prone to, desiring, hierarchy and authority and certainty, and their brains are just built in a way that they can't handle living in ambiguity and questioning things. And so those folks tend to fall into more conservative political camps, right? Whereas folks that have, frankly, more of a developed part of their brain where empathy comes out of, right? The ability to emotionally connect with others, the ability to think critically more or to hold competing ideas in tension with each other, those folks tend to fall to the left of those folks. So some of this is like we're fighting biology and we're just never going to be able to do that completely. And the other problem is I don't know how to make someone care about others. How do you argue like, here's why you should not be a bigot? I don't know how to argue why compassion and love is good if somebody's just like, no, we shouldn't be feeding. Yeah. Some of that's part of the problem too. It's like, how do you make someone empathetic who just is not built that way? And a lot of people to some degree aren't. I think I've been around long enough to figure that out. So it's complicated. Some of it is, tribal and ideological, like we're talking about, and some of it's kind of hardwired in some folks. I don't know. It's tough. And maybe that means we can approach them from a place of compassion while also realizing we gotta outvote them. In some ways, we gotta stop them from getting into power and being a strong base of our society, because we live in a democracy. We live in a republic. These folks have power. I don't know. It's complicated. It's not easy, and I'm curious, guys, sometimes we get attacked from the right, a church like this one, like, well, you guys are just as conservative as we are. You're just conservative about your progressive politics. I'm thinking of our friend. Yeah. We're fundamentalists now, right? Because we're now just as certain that we're right. We're just as certain that we're unquestioning of our thoughts. What do you guys think about that critique? Oh, Julie's like, I got to respond to that.
I mean, I think that critique is not saying it's right or wrong, but I think it's something that if we want to be the kind of community that we want to be, we always have to be doing an inventory and figuring out, have we created a different kind of hierarchical exploitive power? Have we settled on other certainties that wordlessly let people know whether they can come through that door or not? And so I think it's just like here at Central, when we talk about things like
humility and curiosity. I think if we're living into those things, then that critique can fall flat. But I think it's constant vigilance.
Yeah.
Because there is, I guess, like, power and ego are just very tempting.
Yeah, insidious,
for
right?
everyone.
Yeah.
And I was thinking also about Sarah's analogy of the kind of psychology of rape victims. And what comes to mind for me is that a lot of rape victims never come forward. They never cross that threshold because they're like, on the other side of that, I have to blame someone. And what happens to women when they blame is they
Yeah.
get blamed. Like they become witches or whatever, name your point in history. And this issue of like, how do we be a community that could, in the analogy, embrace someone who crosses that threshold where they think no one is going to be there for them?
Mm.
And so politically speaking, like, how do we create not just community here, but promote communities everywhere we go where we actually are ready to embrace someone who changes their mind? Because the thing about cults, whether it's MAGA or, Warren Jeffs, is like, what happens if I cross this threshold? Who's going to be there for me? And I was hoping I'd have an opportunity to bring up this song because I've been so moved by it, out of Minneapolis. So simple, and it's become a protest song, and it says, this is all it says: "It's okay to change your mind. Show us your courage. Leave this behind. It's okay to change your mind, and you can join us. Join us here anytime."
Yeah.
And I love that. I think it's so I mean, they sing it to ICE agents in particular, but
Mm.
I don't know. I think a lot about community and power, and I just feel like in every community there is the potential to go wrong.
Yes.
The if and I love how here we talk about humility and curiosity. That doesn't mean that you can't stand up there and be like, these things that are going on are not loving, they're not compassionate, they're exploitive, right? I think that's very different than like right and wrong.
Yeah. Rusty, please.
I really appreciated it and had never thought about curiosity in that way in relationship to my evangelical upbringing and seen it like that. But it's so striking to me in thinking about it how necessary curiosity is for empathy.
Yes, that's a great point.
It just can't happen without that.
Right. And I love how you put that, because I think in order to be genuinely curious, yes, you have to approach that from a place of empathy and a kind of radical openness and a kind of non-judgmentalism. Like, this is a person I'm talking to. This is a human being. And while I might not agree with their points of view on X, Y, or Z, I'm going to listen to them from a place of non-judgmentalism and curiosity. That's beautiful. And you can hold those things in tension. I may not agree with you, but I'm going to acknowledge your humanity and your right to think and feel a certain way. I think where the trouble comes in is when we're criticized from the right, right, and made to feel like we need to question our commitment to human well-being. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
This idea of like, well, I'm very open to other points of view, very tolerant, but I'm not tolerant of intolerance. You see that? I'm not tolerant of ideas and behaviors and policies that dehumanize and kill others, that end up destroying trans folks. Sorry, that's off the table for me. Concentration camps, no. You know, this is crazy a little bit. This idea that, well, you're in a cult because you're very certain and very fundamentalist about these commitments you have to liberal ideology. You're right. I am committed to human well-being and human flourishing, but I'm not pretending like I have all the answers about what that looks like from one context to the next. But you're right. I have some fundamental convictions about let's pursue things that elevate and create human well-being and human flourishing. Love, compassion, justice, equity. Yeah, I'm pretty committed to those ideas. And you can't, and it's crazy that we have to sometimes entertain folks who want to try to convince us that maybe we should be more committed to the Bible and to this, ancient take from Leviticus that says, gay people are doomed and, we should repudiate same-sex behavior because, the God of the Bible says it. This is insane. It's not just insane. It's stupid. Can we just call it what it is? It's fucking stupid.
Well, it's manipulative.
It's manipulative.
It's not, I don't think it's genuine. It's like, why, if we're talking about human flourishing, why would we go to the Bible or Leviticus or some abstract concept like God and not science,
Right.
psychology?
But again, we have a different starting point epistemologically than they do at that point. I'm still saying it's dumb. I'm sorry, I'm using strong language. And it sounds very judgmental, but I'm just like, I want to use strong language today. Epistemologically, our starting point is what is best for human well-being and human flourishing. Let's look at the science.
Right.
Is there science and studies that show that if we raise children who are gay and trans, telling them you're doomed and you're an abomination to God and you can't be who you are, does that result in higher levels of suicide and other maladies like depression, anxiety? Okay. Yes, we know this. You don't need to have a PhD in psychology or even read the studies to know this. This stuff's intuitive. We have a different epistemological starting point than God says X, Y, and Z in Leviticus 5, and therefore we have to import this into our day and time, and trans folks need to be legislated against, and gay folks need to be forced into conversion therapy, and our children need to be kicked out of their house at age 16 if they refuse to comply. This is insane.
Yeah.
But that's in their mind, epistemologically, the highest level of knowledge and truth starts and ends with scripture and what their pastor says at their church, rather than asking themselves, what is best for human well-being? Well, human well-being and human flourishing.
Yeah.
They don't have that same that's part of the problem. And it's fucking stupid. And it's stupid. And people should know better. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, just earlier when you were saying, and by the way, when I responded immediately, it was, I totally agree with you. Like on the, anyway, I have no words. But when you were talking about, like, I love this quote from James Baldwin, which I looked up because I didn't want to get it wrong. It's so perfect. We can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and the denial of my humanity and right to exist.
Yeah.
Like, that's the thing. That's the thing that I think in this community we will not negotiate on. So if that's the rigidity that we're being,
that's our fundamentalism,
like
Julie.
accused of,
Yeah.
then okay, I'm rigid.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm a conservative. Great. I mean, I love too
I'm a fundamentalist.
What William Barber says about conservatives is that the so-called conservatives are actually the most liberal because they have rejected most of the Bible to focus in on like a few verses.
Yeah. Well, no, and Tad DeLay makes that same critique, who's a friend of ours, scholar. It talks about the real relativists, the moral relativists aren't the liberals. It's the conservative evangelicals who relativize words like love and justice to mean cruelty and barbarism.
Exactly.
Who's the moral relativist that has somehow spun the love of God can include incinerating you in hell? That's moral relativism. You want to talk about ambiguity, the embrace of ambiguity. Well, it's a mystery why God allows this, we don't know. We just have to trust. What's about ambiguity and moral relativism?
Exactly.
Sorry. I get tuned up in these conversations. I got an audience in my
right reason.
I got a different audience in my head that I'm preaching to this morning. Anyway, sorry, Julie. Sorry.
No,
I don't want to be your dad. I don't want to be my dad. Go ahead. Thank you.
Oh, I love this conversation so much. And one of the things that I think about, and the question that you posed, Aaron, of like, what do we do with people coming back and saying, well, no, you're the one who's a fundamentalist and not willing to move.
You're in a cult.
Yeah. And, I think the thing for me that I would see is my beliefs have been like continually evolving and changing. So to try and pin down and be like, you're a fundamentalist in this thing, or like you're unwilling to change, you have these deep held beliefs. I mean, I agree. Foundationally, I do have deep held beliefs, but my faith experience in particular and the way I engage the world has continued to transform, and it has to. And like that is liberalism, right? 'Cause it wasn't that long ago that homosexuality was pathologized in the
Yes.
DSM,
Yeah.
But we grow, we learn more, we do more studies, there's going to be the next issue and the next issue that we're ignorant of now, and we're going to be shocked that it took us so long to get there. Like we've not arrived in any place. And so I guess I do have a certainty now, but it's not a certainty that I'm right. It's a certainty that I used to be wrong. It's like I'm so certain that I used to be wrong.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly what right is, but I know it's a journey and a path in that direction. So I don't know. It just feels disingenuous to compare the two, and that's crazy angering. And I've also been thinking about what you said about the bubble, Sarah. They're like we're in the conservatives are in such this tight knit bubble and not willing to see or do anything, and it's so unbelievably true. I was just visiting our in-laws, and it's like stepping into a different world. In Tennessee, yeah, and
Bible Belt.
Absolutely, and it's it is like the most. It's not just being in the South that is politically very conservative, but it's that like hardcore Christian evangelicalism, like the subset of even the conservative South. And there's so much fear about there's just so much fear about everything being challenging. Our niece is turning 18, and she's taking a gap year before college, and she's doing some mission work, and she's actually trying to come to LA for the summer for 3 months to work with a church in Glendale, no less, and do some evangelizing of the lost folks of Los Angeles. And a million insane things about that, of course. But what's so shocking to me is, and at the same time not, is that her parents, my sister's sister and husband, never, when they're trying to figure out housing and where she's going to stay while she's here and looking for a place where she can, somebody can put her up. And we're like 15 minutes from there now, but they would never, ever ask us to like put her up because we're such a threat to be there. Like, what would it be like if she stayed in our house for 3 months, and what horrible things might happen? And it's like, this is family. It's like, but not you. You guys are family when you visit from a distance. There's so much fear around everything. And so it doesn't matter what you say, because it's safer to just stay inside that little bubble and not ask the questions.
Yeah. And thank you, Bob. Great point. And, we have our own bubbles too sometimes, right? And I just want to encourage curiosity and listening to the other side, and to humanize them as well, and not allow ourselves to, I used a lot of strong language today. I don't want to come across as, uncompassionate, but I also want clarity. So I'm holding these things in tension, and I hope you are too. But we need to conclude our formal time together and continue the conversation if we'd like, one-on-one. But let's, as we always do, let's finish our time together with this joint affirmation and benediction. As we go from this place, we commit ourselves to the path of love, honesty, and humility. We dedicate ourselves, as Christ did, to the cause of justice and the courageous embrace of this life, this world, and each other. Amen. Thank you, everybody, and thanks to all of you who joined us online and who listen later to the podcast. Break. Thanks for listening in on this week's edition of the Central Cast. Hope you enjoyed it and hope you join us next time. Bye-bye.